Hello and welcome to BYJU'S IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper. We have an article on the front page of the Delhi edition which deals with the appointment of judges to the Supreme Court and the Collegium System. Currently, the appointments to India's higher judiciary, that is the Supreme Court and the High Court, is recommended by the Collegium System. The Collegium of the Supreme Court is chaired by the Chief Justice of India and he is assisted by the four senior most judges of the Supreme Court. And the senior most judge of the High Court is also included in the Collegium while making appointments to the High Court. So it is this Collegium which recommends the names of the judges who have to be appointed to the Supreme Court, and it passes these recommendations to the President of India. Of course, the President is bound by the advice of the Council of Ministers, that is essentially the Government of India. The President can either accept these recommendations or he can reject this recommendation. He can reject the recommendation and he can request the Collegium to reconsider the proposal. But if the Collegium reiterates its decision, then the President is bound to accept the recommendations of the Collegium. So if you look at the strength of the Supreme Court, it currently has a sanctioned strength of 31 judges, and right now there are only 27 judges who have been appointed, and as a result there are 4 vacancies at the Supreme Court. So in the month of April, the Supreme Court Collegium had recommended the elevation of the Chief Justice of Jharkhand High Court and the Chief Justice of Guwahati High Court, and this recommendation had been rejected by the government, and it had asked the Collegium to reconsider its recommendation. So right now, the Supreme Court has reiterated its recommendation, and as a result, the President is bound to appoint these 2 Chief Justices as the judges of the Supreme Court. And along with reiterating the previous recommendation, it has also come up with a fresh recommendation. The Supreme Court Collegium has recommended the elevation of Justice Gawai and Justice Suryakant to be appointed as the judges of the Supreme Court. So if this recommendation is accepted by the government, then the Supreme Court will reach its full sanctioned strength of 31 judges. And even if the government rejects these recommendations, then the Collegium only has to reiterate these recommendations, and then the President will be bound to make these appointments. So in this context, let us quickly understand the process of appointing judges to the Supreme Court. Let us look at what the Constitution of India says in this regard, and we shall also talk about the controversy surrounding the Collegium system. The Constitution of India has provided for a Supreme Court under Article 124. As you can see over here, the Constitution says that there will be a Chief Justice of India, and along with him, there will be not more than 7 other judges. This is what the initial Constitution said. So basically, we had 1 Chief Justice of India along with 7 other judges of the Supreme Court. But the same clause also mentions that the Parliament by law can prescribe a larger number. So over the years, the Parliament has increased the sanctioned strength in order to deal with the increasing workload, and the current sanctioned strength of the Supreme Court stands at 31 judges. And Article 124 also says that every judge of the Supreme Court shall be appointed by the President of India by warrant under his hand and seal. But this is not a discretionary power enjoyed by the President. The executive cannot decide on its own the appointment of the judges to the Supreme Court. Instead, it is bound to consult with the other judges of the Supreme Court. And while appointing a judge other than the Chief Justice of India, the President is bound to consult the Chief Justice of India. This is what has been defined under Article 124. As you can see, there is no mention of the Collegium system anywhere in the Indian Constitution. And this article also defines the tenure of a judge of the Supreme Court. He shall hold office until he attains the age of 65 years. Now let us look at the eligibility criteria to become a Supreme Court judge, which has been defined in the Constitution of India. Under the same Article 124, a few basic eligibility criteria have been defined. In order to become a judge of the Supreme Court, the individual has to be an Indian citizen and he should not have exceeded 65 years of age, and he should have either served as a judge of one or more high courts continuously for at least 5 years, or he should have served as an advocate in any of the high courts for at least 10 years, or he should be a distinguished jurist. So these are the only criteria which have been defined under the Constitution of India, and as you can see, there is no mention of the collegium system, there is no mention of seniority being followed in making the appointments, and there is no mention of merit and competence. So if the Constitution of India doesn't provide for the collegium system, then we need to understand as to how the collegium system was established. The collegium system was set up by the Supreme Court in 1993 through a series of judgments which is popularly referred to as the three judges case. This includes the S.P. Gupta case of 1981, the Supreme Court Advocates on Record Association case of 1993, which is also popularly referred to as the second judge's case. And then we have a special reference made by the Supreme Court in 1998, and these three judgments combined together provided for the establishment of the collegium system. In the second judge's case, the Supreme Court tried to protect the independence of the judiciary. The Supreme Court argued that since judiciary represents one of the key pillars of a democracy, it has to be shielded and protected from any interference from the legislature and as well as from the executive. And one way to ensure the independence of the judiciary is to shield the appointment process from any sort of interference from the legislature and the executive. This was the argument made by the Supreme Court while it provided for the establishment of the collegium system, which has been in practice since 1993. But over the years, the collegium system has been heavily criticized because of its opaqueness in functioning. Critics have argued that the collegium system lacks transparency and the collegium holds closed door meetings in order to decide the elevation and appointment of judges, and in most cases, the details of the meeting is kept away from the public. While making appointments, the collegium was generally guided by the seniority convention. It would generally appoint the senior-most judge of a high court, and he would be elevated to be appointed as a judge of the Supreme Court. But there have been many cases where the seniority convention has been bypassed, and a number of judges who are behind in the seniority list have managed to supersede the other senior judges in the list. And the collegium has justified the bypassing of the seniority factor in some of the cases by saying that such recommendations were made on the basis of merit and competence. But the problem is, merit and competence is hard to define. It is not established in any law, and since it is not clearly defined, it gives a lot of scope for discretion in making appointments to the higher judiciary. And for that matter, even the seniority convention is not prescribed in any law, it is not well defined, but at least the seniority convention would provide for greater transparency, because the public in general would know as to which judges would be next in line to be appointed as judges of the Supreme Court. But since the seniority factor has been frequently bypassed and appointments are being made on the grounds of merit and competence, it gives a lot of discretion for the collegium, and it raises a doubt that whether these appointments are being made to favor certain candidates. So essentially, the appointment process in one of the key pillars of democracy itself is undemocratic. So in order to provide for transparency in the appointment process, the government of India proposed the establishment of the National Judicial Appointments Commission. In 2014, the Indian government introduced a constitution amendment bill in the parliament in order to amend Article 124 and Article 217 of the Indian Constitution. The parliament passed this bill and it became the 99th Constitutional Amendment Act, which established the National Judicial Appointments Commission. This body would be responsible for making appointments to the higher judiciary, and it tried to counter the opaqueness in the Collegium system by trying to introduce greater transparency, and it tried to counter the domination of the judiciary by providing a space for the executive to play a role in the appointment process. If you look at the composition of NJAC, the Chief Justice of India would be the ex officio chairperson, and the members included two senior most judges of the Supreme Court, and even their membership was on an ex officio basis. It also included the Union Law Minister, again on an ex officio basis, and two eminent persons would be appointed by a selection committee. As you can see, the judiciary was allowed to retain its dominance in the appointment process, but to provide for greater checks and balances, a role for the executive was also included. And these eminent persons would be nominated by a selection committee comprising of the Chief Justice of India, the Prime Minister of India, and the leader of opposition in the Lok Sabha. But this attempt to introduce transparency could not work out because the very next year, the Supreme Court declared the 99th Constitutional Amendment as unconstitutional, and it struck down the National Judicial Appointments Commission Act. By declaring the NJAC as unconstitutional, the Supreme Court restored the Collegium System for making appointments to India's higher judiciary. Now let's take up the next article. The Indian Navy has participated in a maritime exercise in the South China Sea by taking part in group sailing with the navies of United States, Japan, and Philippines. The main objective of this exercise was to promote maritime security in the region and enhance interoperability and coordination with like-minded nations such as US, Japan, and Philippines. So this could be seen as a subtle message targeted against China because the South China Sea is hotly contested and there are multiple maritime disputes that China has with various Southeast Asian countries including Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia, etc. So due to these standing maritime disputes, China has displayed a lot of aggression in the South China Sea, and it has even attempted to block the passage of naval ships and other commercial ships in the South China Sea region. So whenever such incidents have taken place, both US and India have taken a similar stand, and especially India has reiterated the fact that freedom of navigation is a fundamental right in international waters. And prior to this naval exercise, the Indian Navy had deployed INS Kolkata and INS Shakti on a long-term deployment to the South China Sea and as well as to the East China Sea. As a part of this deployment, the two naval ships have visited Vietnam, China, and South Korea. Vietnam is a crucial defense partner for India in the Southeast Asian region, and the Indian Navy has conducted an exercise with the Vietnamese Navy. Indian Navy has also visited China, and it has participated in the International Fleet Review, which was organized by the People's Liberation Army Navy of China. This also highlights the fact that India tries to balance the conflict with China by promoting cooperation. And in South Korea, the naval ships have taken part in a maritime exercise under the ADMM+. ADMM stands for ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting. It is one of the platforms available under the ASEAN, which is a regional organization comprising of 10 Southeast Asian nations. So under the ADMM platform, the 10 defense ministers of all the Southeast Asian nations, they interact to promote cooperation in the field of security, counter-terrorism, piracy, etc. But this platform was enhanced in 2010 and it is known as ADMM+. Under the ADMM+ platform, the 10 ASEAN countries have invited the 8 dialogue partners of ASEAN. This includes Australia, China, India, Japan, New Zealand, South Korea, Russia, and the United States. So under the ADMM Plus format, there are 18 major powers in the region which are taking part in joint summits and joint exercises with the objective of strengthening security and defense cooperation. Now let's take up an article from the editorial page. The editorial, loud and clear, deals with the tensions between India and US in the area of trade and commerce. Recently, the US Commerce Secretary had visited India and he was extremely critical of the Indian government for adopting unfair trade practices and restricting market access to American companies. This criticism highlights the structural issues which exist between India and US, and it is a direct result of the ongoing trade war between the two countries. Over the last 1 year, there have been some serious developments. First, we had the United States, which imposed a higher tariff on steel and aluminium imports from India. Next, the US gave India a deadline to zero out oil imports from Iran. And more recently, the US has withdrawn the GSP trade status for India. These developments clearly indicate the aggressive approach that the Trump government has adopted against India. The Trump administration has even labeled India as a tariff king, which is basically a criticism of the higher taxes and import duties that is imposed by India in order to protect its domestic market. And the US has even gone to the extent of threatening India with serious consequences if it imposes any counter tariffs on these tariffs imposed by the United States. So this clearly highlights that there is a structural problem which exists in India's relations with the US. And the editorial says that it is high time for both India and US to recognize these problems and start working towards a compromise. The editorial says that the Indian government cannot deny that there are no issues with the United States. The Indian government cannot hope that the US will be preoccupied with its trade wars with China and it will pay less attention to India, because the Trump government and Trump himself has displayed personal aggression with regard to the trade war with India. So this clearly highlights the fact that both India and US need to recognize the existing problems and they should start working out solutions. For example, India indeed imposes very high duties and tariffs on certain American imports. For example, bikes, cars and even liquor, which is imported from the US, invites a very high tariff from India. This is something that India can reconsider. On the other hand, the US should understand that the average tariff imposed by India stands at around 13.8%. This is nearly the same tariff which is imposed by other countries such as South Korea and Brazil. So on an average, the tariffs imposed by India is at par with the taxes or tariffs imposed by other developing countries. Then India should also have a relook at some of the new laws and regulations which have been proposed with regard to data localization and the regulation of the e-commerce sector, because these regulations and laws which have been proposed, they have caused a great deal of concern for the American companies. Some of these provisions go against innovation and competition, and hence India should genuinely have a relook at these proposed laws and regulations. And at the same time, the US needs to understand why India imposes a price cap on essential medical equipment and medical devices. So according to the editorial, these are some of the areas where a compromise can be worked out. But at the same time, there are few unreasonable demands which are being made by the United States, and these are the issues where India should push the US by standing its ground. This really applies for the American pressure which is being imposed on India with regard to the import of Iranian oil. Now let's take up the next editorial. Recently in Afghanistan, the Loya Jirga or the Grand Assembly had a meeting, and this Grand Assembly includes senior tribal leaders, religious figures and senior politicians. And the main topic of discussion of the Loya Jirga was to find a resolution to end the conflict in Afghanistan. So at the end of this Grand Assembly, the leaders have given a call for a ceasefire between the Afghan government and the Taliban forces which are engaged in an insurgent war against the Afghan government. And the Grand Assembly has also asked President Ashraf Ghani to set up a negotiating team which consists of members from the Afghan assembly to talk to the Taliban. Because right now, Ashraf Ghani has refused to negotiate or to engage in talks with the Taliban. Because the Taliban continues to target the Afghan government, it continues to lead an insurgent war against the Ashraf Ghani government. But based on the recommendations of the Grand Assembly, Ashraf Ghani has agreed to call for a ceasefire, and he is even willing to set up a negotiating team to begin talks with the Taliban. But the Taliban has clearly rejected this proposal. It doesn't want to engage in any talks with the Afghan government, and it has promised to increase the scale of attacks throughout the month of Ramzan. The reason why Taliban is unwilling to negotiate is because today the Taliban is in a position of power. It nearly controls 50% of Afghan territory. It knows that the Afghan government has become weaker, and if it prolongs this conflict, it can further snatch power from the Afghan government. This is where the editorial is asking the United States to play a very responsible role in order to resolve this conflict. Because right now, the US is engaging in talks with the Taliban through a parallel arrangement. The US has even appointed a special representative, that is Mr. Zalmay Khalilzad, to engage in direct talks with the Taliban. But the primary objective of the US is to just exit Afghanistan as soon as possible by working out a face-saving deal. It wants to remove its troops as soon as possible by working out a mutually beneficial arrangement. As a part of this deal, the US is willing to allow Taliban to return to power in some way or the other, and in return, it will expect that Taliban will not provide Afghan territory to be used by terror groups such as Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State, because these terror outfits pose a direct threat to the United States. So as long as Taliban assures that Al-Qaeda and Islamic State will not be given space in Afghanistan, the US is willing to allow the Taliban to return to power. So the only way the Afghan government can regain ground is by exerting military pressure on the Taliban. But unfortunately, the Afghan government is not strong enough. Its armed forces have been weakened, and they lack the resources to fight an insurgent war against the Taliban. This is where the editorial is asking the United States to provide Afghanistan with the required support in the form of weapons, training, funding, etc., and ensure that the Afghan forces are strong enough to fight an insurgent war against the Taliban. Next, we have an article on page 18 which says that the Lakshadweep administration will be using barn owls in order to fight against the menace of rats which are destroying its coconut plantations. For Lakshadweep, the coconut plantations are a very important source of revenue, but these rodents, they have turned into a pest, and their increasing population is posing a great threat for these coconut plantations. So in order to counter the rising population of the rats, the Lakshadweep administration has decided to use the barn owls as part of a biocontrol measure. So the usage of a predator to control the rising pest population can be labeled as a biocontrol measure. And the reason why barn owls are being used instead of cats or rat snakes is because most of the rats in Lakshadweep, they are found on these coconut trees. So hence barn owls can be an effective predator to reduce the population of this pest. And barn owls are nocturnal and they have special auditory mechanisms which makes them a natural rat hunter. So these barn owls are present across the world except for the polar and icy areas of the Arctic, Antarctic and Canada. It is also not found in the desert areas of Africa. It is also not found in the northern parts of Asia and across Indonesia. Apart from these regions, barn owls can be found in every other part of the world. And its IUCN status is of least concern, and it is a protected bird species under Schedule 3 of the Wildlife Protection Act of India. So kindly remember the range of this bird, its IUCN status and protection status under Indian legislation. Now let's take up the practice questions. Which of the following statements are correct? Judges of the Supreme Court are appointed by the Collegium. Judges of the Supreme Court can be removed by the President. Both the statements are wrong because the Collegium only recommends the names of the judges, but they are appointed by the President. Whereas judges of the Supreme Court can be removed only through the impeachment process and not by the President. So option D is the correct answer. Now let's take up the second question. Which of the following statements are correct? Bhutan is carbon negative country. It is correct. Its constitution mandates that 60% of the country remains forested. This is again a correct statement. So option C is the right answer. Now let's take up the third question. Which of the following statements are correct? Rajaji Tiger Reserve is located in Uttarakhand and it encompasses the Shivaliks. This is a correct statement. It has been named after C. Rajagopalachari. This is again a correct statement. So option C is your right answer. Now let's take up a map-based question. Which of the following statements are correct? North Korea shares a land border with 3 countries. It is bound by the Korea Bay and Sea of Japan. Both the statements are correct. So option C is the right answer. Please look at the map. North Korea shares a land border with China, Russia and South Korea, and it is bound by the Korea Bay and the Sea of Japan. Now let's take up a question from the 2015 prelims paper. Who amongst the following were economic critics of colonialism in India? Dadabhai Naoroji, G. Subramanya Iyer and R.C. Dutt. All the 3 were economic critics of colonialism. So option D is the right answer. And before we conclude the session, we have a small announcement. Volume 3 of Target Prelims has been uploaded on our website and the link for the same will be provided in the description box below. So this concludes our section for the day. Thanks for watching.